Good morning, everyone. Dr. Boghossian here. Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy class, where we've been looking at our unit of material called Philosophy of Religion in your textbook. That's in the table of contents. It's under Philosophy of Religion. I phrased it in terms of one of life's ultimate questions: does God exist, or the God question? The last couple of lectures, we've looked at different arguments for God's existence, arguments, rational, deductive or inductive arguments that provide reasons theists believe for thinking that God does exist. And that is, God is what's most real, let's say. And so God should be part of our worldview, our metaphysic, our philosophical system. Today, we're going to look at arguments against the existence of God. And like we're doing all semester, we're trying to look at arguments on 2 or 3 sides of every issue. And so today we're going to look at different versions of the problem of evil, it's called. So let me pull up the screen. You'll want to make sure to get over to Canvas and obtain the handout, the note sheet handout that goes along with this, so that way you can track along and then study and prepare well for the exam. Here we go. Let me pull up the screen. Okay, this question of God's existence, again, by way of review, is a question that is many thousand years old, 2,000 to 3,000 years old. It goes back to the ancient Greeks with their philosophies that centered around polytheism in the case of Plato, although there were many detractors who were, you might call non-theists in his own day. Today, we've been focusing on monotheism because that's how this question and issue has evolved, if you will, throughout Western history, even though Western civilization and Western philosophy, and as well as Western religions, have been informed by Plato and Greek philosophy and polytheism. We've been focusing on the question of, is there a single God that's all-powerful, morally perfect, acts for reasons, the explanation of everything other than himself, or the creator of everything other than himself, and so on. If you say yes to that, there is such a being, and let's suppose you find the Kalam and the design arguments to be compelling, as well as maybe the moral argument and some other things you heard in the debate between Stephen Law and William Lane Craig, there's still this really pressing question, and this is taken to be the kicker for many agnostics and atheists. And that is the question, well, if you believe in a morally perfect God that knows everything and is maximally powerful, what do we do with all the bad stuff in the world? And we're not talking about like, disappointment, and that could be put in here, right? Like not being able to date the person you want to date. We're talking more strongly about categorically what we can classify as evil, right? And suffering. And this goes back to this question was really pressed by David Hume, the Scottish skeptic, who we offered some critiques of Paley's argument last time. Same philosopher. He said this: Epicurus, right, the Greek philosopher Epicurus, his age-old questions are yet unanswered. Is God willing to prevent evil but unable? That means, is God wanting to do something about evil and suffering in the world but lacks the ability or the power? Well, then he is not all-powerful, right? That compromises the theistic commitment to omnipotence. Is he able? So does he have the power and ability and the skill, let's say, but he's not willing, he doesn't want to? Well, then that makes him malevolent. In other words, it compromises his moral perfection, his moral goodness. Is he both able and willing, all-powerful and morally good, right? Well, then what's up with evil, right? How do you explain that? And so this is often considered by theists and non-theists alike an inconsistent triad for the theist. Inconsistent here means logically inconsistent, where a theist can't at the same time accept the truth of all 3 of the following statements. They can accept 2, but they have to give up one of the others, right? So here we go. Let's suppose a theist accepts that God is all-powerful and all-knowing and is perfectly good. Well, then they're going to have to do something with evil, right? They're going to either have to deny it exists or do something else with it. But if you accept that evil is real in some sense, right? People do evil things, or there are truly tragic and horrible events that are bad, objectively bad. well, then you either have to give up on God's omnipotence and omniscience or God's goodness. So you can have evil and moral perfection, 2 and 3, or 3 and 1, or 1 and 2, but you can't have all three. Is that right? Is this an inconsistent triad? This helps us get the problem of evil going. And we're going to look at two versions of the problem of evil today. One is called the logical problem of evil, and the other is what we might call the evidential or existential problem. The logical problem that we're going to look at first really tries to make the case that any evil at all, of any kind, is logically inconsistent with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. Okay, so this is powerful. This would mean one instance of bad in the world would be sufficient to rule out the existence of a morally perfect God. And this is how the argument goes. Premise 1, if God exists of the kind that we've laid out, then there would be no evil in the world. But there's evil in the world, right? We can look around and find some, and therefore God doesn't exist. This is a deductive argument of the form called modus tollens. It's a valid deductive argument, so you can get to the conclusion from the premises. But now the question is, are premises 1 and 2 both true? And what the theist is going to do, or may do, is attack either premise 1 or premise 2 to demonstrate that this argument fails. The most common way is to go after premise 1, and so we're going to look at why that's the case by first considering what one might say to reject premise 2. But for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, rejecting premise 2 is not a theologically welcomed approach, and we'll see why here. So here we go. First, let's define what we mean by evil. And in this debate, there's usually two kinds of evil that we have in mind, right? And these exhaust the kinds of evil. Number one, there's what we might call moral evil. And so write this down. Moral evil is the misuse or abuse of one's moral agency. Now, this could be a human moral agent, a non-human moral agent, like if a person believes in other kinds of moral agencies like spirits or demons or angels, good or bad, let's say. So anything that has that is a moral being. So one way this is carved up is typically humans are seen as moral agents. They can do right or wrong. Whereas a grasshopper is not a moral agent, or even a dog is not a moral agent. Now, they can do things that humans don't like, but that doesn't mean that they do what's right or wrong. As far as we know in the animal kingdom, there's no category for murder, the intentional taking of innocent animal life. Instead, there's killing, right? But it's an amoral form of killing, right? Because it's just part of what's called predation. Some animals prey on others. That's just how the ecosystem works, right? So what we're interested in here is the misuse or abuse of moral agency. And that could be making immoral choices, right? That leads to evil and suffering. So the choice itself is objectively immoral, but the evil arises usually as a result of that choice. So let's get concrete. If you say something really horrible to another person that's deeply hurtful or demeaning, that's your misuse of your speech, right? Of your decision-making activity related to your speech and what you do to another person. You bring about suffering or evil in their life by doing something immoral to them through your speech. Physical assault, right? Exploitation. Those would all be examples of moral evil. Okay, murder, rape, genocide, all the things, right? Racism, sexism, etc. Now, the second kind of evil is what we might call non-moral evil. This is bad stuff that occurs in the world that's objectively bad and unfortunate and causes deep suffering to non-human animals as well as human beings. Damage to infrastructure that undermines civilizations. We might call this natural evil because it's not the result of moral agencies, although some might take issue with this, as we'll see. Rather, it's nature running its course, right? We have natural disasters like hurricanes, floods, storms of different kinds, volcanoes, right? And they wreak havoc on the natural order, do great destruction, and they bring evil and suffering into human life. So now the question is this: can God's existence be made logically compatible or consistent with the existence of either of those kinds of evil, or both? Now, there are two approaches to an answer to that question from theists. One is to offer what's called a defense. And it's really crucial that you keep these separate because they're trying to do very different things. And if you're expecting a theist to do both with one response, that's an unfair, right? That's straddling them with an unfair kind of burden. It is fair to straddle them with a burden for, given the kind of argument a person lays out, an agnostic or an atheist, or even a theist who is questioning the existence of God and thinking through these issues. A defense is aimed at the logical problem of evil. It's trying to show that there is no logical inconsistency between our three claims, that God's existence and God being all powerful and all knowing, as well as morally perfect, is logically consistent with the existence of evil in the world of either kind. That's called a defense because it's going to try to reconcile logically the existence of evil on the one hand and the existence of God on the other, and show that there's no logical inconsistency. So we're going to start there. What people usually are asking or objecting to is this second kind of approach. This is where you hear people say, well, where is God? Where was God when the Holocaust happened? Where was God when Hurricane Katrina hit? Where is God when my family was pulled apart? Where was God when I was being bullied in high school or junior high? Okay, why does God allow those things to happen to decent people, let's say, or people who were, did nothing wrong? That is something that's asking for an explanation to the why question. And that when theists try to account for why, they're offering a theodicy of some kind. And there are different kinds of theodicies. We'll talk about one in particular that the reading from John Hick in your book that you were to have read or need to read for this week. He's giving a theodicy, one kind called an Irenaean theodicy. There's also Augustinian theodicies. There's other kinds of greater good theodicies. John Hick isn't really giving a greater good theodicy. And so we'll look at his form. There are lots of kinds. And you can hear a theodicy of a particular kind come up in the Stephen Law, William Lane Craig debate, as well as a defense. Craig uses both of those. But a theodicy is trying to say, well, these are some possible reasons why God might allow moral and natural evil. Okay, so we're still doing some setup here, right? So we've defined our terms. Now what we're going to do is look at how someone who believes in God might reject premise 2 of the logical problem of evil that we already have in our notes and put up on a previous slide, right? If God exists, there would be no evil. But evil exists. Okay, premise 2 is evil exists. Is that true? Someone might say, well, no, that's not true. Okay, what do we do with that premise? Well, someone might say, well, evil is really an illusion. We think there's evil, but the problem is with our cognitive disposition or response or our cognitive grasp of the world. We're not currently seeing rightly. We're living under an illusion. We think there's bad and evil in the world, but it's not real. Now, you get this kind of statement in some Eastern religions like Buddhism and so on, where what we need is enlightenment. We currently aren't attuned to see the world correctly. And so we might see bad, but really what it is it's a problem with us. It's not a problem with what's going on in the world. Now, of course, those religions aren't theistic. And that's why theists aren't typically going to be inclined to say that evil is an illusion. And more exactly, all three Western monotheisms have some kind of component in their theology where evil is real in some sense, even if it's not a thing itself, like the yin and the yang, right? It's not a substance. There are evil beings, there are evil actions, there are evil situations or states of affairs. And so evil is not an illusion. It's a reality in some way. It's what Augustine called a privation or a departure from what's good, the ideal mark of goodness. It's a departing from it. So evil is real in some sense, at least, in all monotheisms. So they might then say, okay, premise 2 is false because God is limited. God is finite like us. And he knows more and is stronger than us and is better than and morally better than humans, but he still is limited. He's not infinite, as William Lane Craig says. And so if he's limited, well, then that sort of explains evil is real in some sense, but notice that's really not falsifying premise 2. It's actually compromising on the nature of God to try to get around the argument. Now, this is going to be unwelcome to almost all varieties of theism because they believe that God is infinite in the in his power. That is, he's unlimited in power, unlimited in moral goodness, unlimited in love, and unlimited in wisdom, and so on. Okay, so if the only kind of theism that would accept the claim that God is finite is what's called process theism, and we have a presence of this down in Southern California and other philosophy departments like Claremont. And so you can find this in some places where God is seen as finite. But that's not what we're talking about, right? That would sort of end the discussion in a certain way, because it throws in the towel and says God can't do anything about evil. Theists don't want to say that. Well, then you might say, well, we don't say evil is unreal, but evil is just part of the way the world is. And so the way you reconcile God's existence with the natural world is to say that evil is kind of hardwired into matter, right? The structures of the world. Now, this is going to be a problem, right? Because that's actually at odds with God being a creator of good things. That would compromise God's moral perfection. So all of these are failed responses to the logical problem of evil. They're not going to be satisfying either to theists or non-theists. Usually non-theists are going to be concerned with, well, if we have a God that we're supposed to follow, right, and trust, who's worthy of worship and arranging your life around, we need to be able to trust this God, and that requires a certain moral, kind of fiber to the being of God that doesn't make things that are just hardwired for evil. So if those are off the table as options, how might a theist respond? Well, the most famous response is called Plantinga's free will defense. Let me actually show you the book here. Within the last 25 to 30 years or so, actually, this book right here, God, Freedom, and Evil, you can still find this on Amazon. I think it's got a purple cover now. I have an older version of it. You can buy it. It's relatively inexpensive. Okay, so 40 years. This was written in 1974. Okay. Alvin Plantinga is still alive. He's retired, taught the last 25 years of his career at Notre Dame. And he's considered one of the most prominent and influential philosophers of religion of the last 40 years. He took on the logical problem of evil with the atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie, who I've listed on your notes. And he is seen by many, both atheists and theists alike, to have put to rest in this book the logical problem of evil. Not all versions of it, as we'll see, but he argues in this book that there's a way to reconcile the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God with the existence of evil logically. Now, it's not going to explain the why question, but it'll logically reconcile their coexistence. How? Well, we have to understand what God is like and what we mean by these attributes of God, as well as what humans are like. So he says, let's define human personhood. If we define human persons as limited, finite centers of freedom, right, having free will, and that means that they are self-directing and they're morally responsible for their own decisions. We deliberate about our choices in many or most cases, and that means we set out to accomplish certain ends and direct ourselves towards those ends when we act. That makes us responsible. We actually choose between live options in many cases. Well then, okay, that's important, right? Well, why? Because, well, that would imply that we can make bad choices. We can misuse or abuse our freedom. We can misdirect ourselves, misguide ourselves, but we're responsible for those decisions precisely because we were free to do otherwise. We didn't have to, yell at someone and cuss them out because we're angry. We could have handled that anger different, or we can become a kind of person who doesn't manage our anger in that way, let's say. So for Plantinga, right, this is called a free will defense. He says, well, look, to be a person is different than being a puppet or being an automaton. We're not determined all the way down. Now, of course, that's controversial. We'll debate free will here in a couple weeks. But if he's right about that, right, at least logically, if free will is real, if we really make free choices for which we're morally responsible, decisions, again, that are up to us to direct and guide ourselves towards, well, then that explains moral evil, because moral evil is the result of our misusing or abusing our free will. And so that would account for exploitation, murder, rape, theft, domestic abuse, you name it, right? So think of the human domain. Nearly all evil and suffering would be pretty quickly explicable logically in terms of the existence of persons. Now, you might say, well, couldn't God have made a world where there are free beings who only do what's right? They only direct themselves to what's good. And J.L. Mackie pressed this in print with Plantinga. He said, well, look, if God's all powerful, I mean, he could make a world like we know it, like this one, where human beings, like every time, you or I are about to say a hurtful thing, he somehow supernaturally intervenes and like corrects us, right? Redirects us so we don't do that. Or he, overrides the free will of Hitler by giving a heart attack or stopping him from orchestrating a Holocaust, etc. But notice here, Plantinga has a reply, and John Hick actually leverages this reply in his paper, the first part of his paper, before he develops his theodicy. He says, well, look, actually, no. Logically speaking, if God exists, and of the relevant sort that we've defined, and if God is made persons, as defined by Plantinga, that we're self-directing, limited centers of freedom, then it's impossible to make beings like that who can only choose what's right or good. Okay? It's impossible for God to create persons who can only choose that. Now I want you to hear that very carefully. That's very carefully worded by Plantinga. You and I could choose only the good freely, but what God can't do is front load the dice, so to speak, right? Or front load the system to where we only choose what's good, and that's built into our DNA. It still has to be logically and metaphysically possible for at least one of us to act out of accordance with what's right and good. That's what being a person is. Now, persons could choose the right and good, but they can't be made to choose it. It can't be a logical and metaphysical impossibility, because then what's happened? Well, what's happened there, says Plantinga, is God can make a world where beings don't do wrong, but those would not be persons. Those would be non-persons. They would be puppets. They would be automatons. They would be machines, but they wouldn't be persons. Personhood brings with it moral agency, and moral agency brings with it a concept, by conceptual notion, it brings with it ideas like mind, deliberation, conscious deliberation, will, and that is up to us, where we really work through in our minds, let's say, even quickly, what we think is best or what we want to do and why. We act for reasons. So reply is, God can't make a world. It's a logical can't. It's logically impossible for God to make a world with human persons who only do what's right. It's at least remotely possible that one of those persons goes wrong. Okay? Now, this is all interesting, right? Because if you're a theist, you might even be uncomfortable with that. And Plantinga is a Christian theist. But you might be uncomfortable with that because you might say, God can't make a world like that. Okay, we'll come back to that question on the next slide. But let me just work through real quickly let me show you an argument why, if God were to correct us or redirect us every time we're about to go wrong, that actually brings in divine necessitation of our choices, and therefore we would never be free with respect to any decision. And then that means we're non-persons. So here we go. So I'll pick a pretty generic example. Let's suppose right now it's necessarily true. It's a logical necessity, like 2 + 2 is 4 is a logical necessity. It can't possibly be 5 once we understand the concept 2 and the concept and so on. All right, let's suppose a necessary truth also is, right now today, looking ahead to Friday, there's a necessary truth that's already fixed, that on Friday at 12 noon, you're going to eat a burrito for lunch. Make it a veggie burrito if you're vegetarian, or if you're not a vegetarian, maybe it has some meat in it. Okay, but that's a true statement. That's not a possible truth. That's a necessary truth. Necessary is logically very strong. That means it can't possibly turn out to be false when you get to 12 noon on Friday, right? So if at 12 noon on Friday, right now it's necessarily true now and tomorrow and the next day and until you get to Friday that you're going to eat the burrito for lunch, well then what you have here is a logical must now of some future event. Okay, so you must eat the burrito at lunch on Friday. But if you must eat the burrito at lunch on Friday at 12 noon, then when you get there now, or when you get there, you're not free to refrain from eating the burrito. And refrain from can either mean you fast, or you pick the burger instead, or the salad instead, or something like that. But if that's right, then you're not free to not eat a burrito for lunch at 12 Friday on noon if it's necessarily true that that's what's going to happen. By analogy, if God necessitates that at any point where you're about to misuse your freedom, it's true that you won't do that, then we can run that through this same argument, and then what you must choose at any point is the good. But then what that means is you're not free. Those actions are not up to you. And so it's logically impossible for God to make free beings, human persons, says Plantinga, but also ensure that they do what's right. That's not a possible world for God to make. It's not feasible for God to do that. Instead, what's logically possible is for God to make a different kind of world where there are other beings that aren't moral, like maybe we're made of silicone and we're not conscious. We're just, I don't know, robots. Well, we're not morally responsible, right? Then, because we're not moral beings. Okay, what does this do with omnipotence? Has this made God finite and limited? Is this, when you start saying it's logically impossible for God, is that limiting God? And theists and atheists alike might be concerned about this. And Plantinga says, no, what's actually going on here is there's a misunderstanding about omnipotence. In discussions and debates in the literature about divine all power, you get these, what's called the paradox of omnipotence. Can God make a rock so big that he can't move it? If you say yes, well, then he's not all powerful. If you say no, well, then he's not all powerful, right? So, well, Plantinga says, no, that's a misunderstanding, because omnipotence means, and this is actually the most dominant view, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Among Muslim philosophers, you have more people who would depart from this. I'll come back to that. But omnipotence for Plantinga, which is pretty common, is that God can do whatever is logically possible, whatever is meaningful, and whatever makes sense at all. Now, to be careful here, logically possible isn't, some people will say, well, aren't we imposing human logic on God? Well, the answer is no, right? Logic is grounded in the very nature of God. God is a logical being. For there to be logic at all, Plantinga would say, you need God, right? God's made humans in his image. We have a rational nature and we use logic, but there isn't human logic and divine logic. There's just logic, just like there's math, and math is grounded in the very mind and being of God, right? If there's one God, you'd have to have mathematical concepts already. And where do those come from? Well, those are embedded in the very nature of God. He doesn't invent them. He can't make 2 + 2 = 5. That's a logical impossibility for God. It's not meaningful. It doesn't make sense. God can't square a circle. Whatever a circle is conceptually, it's conceptually necessary that it's spherical, right? It doesn't have 4 equal angles like a square. God can't make a rock so big that he can't move it, right? God can't, let's say, what's another one here? God can't make murder right. If murder is objectively wrong, then God can't make it right, right? That's not, God isn't less, less powerful because of that. That just means omnipotence has to be understood consistently within relation to the other attributes of God, within relation to God's nature. So omnipotence means that God can do whatever is compatible with and consistent with the divine nature, and that includes moral perfection, God knowing all there is to know, God acting for reasons, and so on. And so God can't literally do anything. That's not all power. Maximal power has to be understood properly within his nature. Now, applied to our discussion here, omnipotence doesn't include God being able to do the logically impossible, because again, that would be inconsistent with the nature of God. That would be incompatible for a God who acts on the basis of logic, which is grounded in his own being, let's say. In fact, C.S. Lewis, you may have heard of. C.S. Lewis says, nonsense doesn't cease being nonsense because you put God can in front of it, okay? And that's another way of stating the same point. So Plantinga and C.S. Lewis and Craig and all of them, Aquinas, are all on the same page here. Omnipotence means that God can do just about everything, right? But it's whatever is logically and metaphysically possible, consistent with the nature of God. So the bottom line for Plantinga is the reason there's evil is that God has made a free choice to put persons on, as bring about persons as part of the universe, put them on the planet, let's say, as far as we know. And once he's made that choice, it's logically impossible for God to actualize such beings as us and make sure that we never abuse our free will. Okay? What he'd have to do is make a different kind of world, and God is free to do that. But for reasons maybe we are not privy to, he has, let's say, chosen to make human beings. Now, Craig and Plantinga would say something like, God has chosen to make human beings because maybe this is the best of all possible worlds. We add value to this kind of world. God really values interpersonal relationship with humans and other sorts of personal beings. And so what that does, right, is that reconciles God's omnipotence, God's goodness, and free will, because the reason the way evil is logically compatible with God's existence is that God hasn't brought about evil. God instead has brought about a world where it's possible for others within that world to go wrong, and they have gone wrong, namely us as humans. And so for at least a time, he allows that to happen. Now you might say, well, but why allow that? Why make a world where that's even possible? Even if we've reconciled evil in the existence of God, that still leaves this pressing existential question of, well, why is there so much heartache, right? Why is there so much difficulty in our world? Why are there pandemics and racism and unrest and broken relationships and exploitation, etc.? Well, one possibility that theists like Plantinga have hinted at is that maybe non-moral evils like natural disasters can be explained in terms of moral evil. Maybe there are other moral agencies like bad angels, right, that God allows to wreak havoc on the natural order, including humans. And you get this in the story of the Hebrew scriptures of Job. Job is inflicted with boils, his livestock is wiped out, his family is killed by the devil and his minions because God permits that. So natural evil is caused by, like earthquakes, all this is caused by other agencies. Now that's not John Hick's view or Craig's view necessarily. Their view is that, right, these things arise because God has made a world with statistical consistencies, right? Laws of nature, that when laws of nature do what they do within our universe, our ecosystem, hurricanes arise, earthquakes arise, storms arise that wipe out human beings and infrastructure and so on. And so John Hick's answer to the why there is non-moral evil is that it's simply part of the natural order. That's different than saying, though, that it's built into the matter. So matter and energy are not evil. It's that when you have a finely tuned universe can allow for, right, it can lead to natural evil when there are animals, human and non-human animals alike, that can experience the repercussions of natural systems running their course. Here's what John Hick has to say. Christianity has never supposed that God's purpose in creation of the world was to construct a paradise whose inhabitants experience a maximum amount of pleasure and a minimum amount of pain. The world is seen instead as a place of soul-making in which free beings grappling with the tasks and challenges of their existence in a common environment may become children of God and heirs of eternal life. Okay, so why does God allow evil, even moral evil? John Hick's theodicy, he calls it a soul-making theodicy, goes all the way back to a theologian by the name of Saint Irenaeus. And the idea here is that God has brought about humans. Why create humans who could go wrong and experience tragedy and suffering and horror? Well, because human beings are valuable and good and bring God joy, and he desires to be in relationship with them. But he hasn't put us here already kind of fully formed, right? He puts us here where we need to be formed into certain kinds of people that reflect God's goodness, grace, mercy, love, forgiveness, generosity, and so on. We have to be formed made into a good person, a virtuous person that reflects the good, virtuous nature of God. So God allows there to be evil for this current point in history for us to be able to grapple with the difficulties of life so that we can be formed into good people. People who, let's say, reflect the loving nature of Jesus of Nazareth, the loving nature of God. And even outside of the Christian religion, right, you get something similar to this. You can find remnants of this in Judaism and Islam, right, where what God is up to is he's trying to form his people to be like himself. Why? Well, because that's actually good for other humans. If I will act more loving and more generous and more kind and merciful, that's going to help others grapple with the challenges of life that they face. That's going to help deal with things like racism and exploitation, human trafficking, and so on. And so why God allows evil is so that we can become better humans, right? We can become more developed. And that's what we're here for. Part of the purpose of why we exist is to become good human beings, to become full. Irenaeus said, the glory of humanity fully alive is the glory of God. That's a paraphrase. So we're here to flourish and thrive and be fully alive. Evil allows us an opportunity to flower and flourish and thrive and develop, even though at times we experience gut-wrenching difficulties. Now, what we're going to look at here in the remaining time is the second kind of argument from evil. We just dealt with the logical problem and a little bit of the existential problem, but now I want to talk about what's called the existential argument or the evidential argument from evil. And this was William Rowe's paper that you were to have read for today, okay? William Rowe is taught at Purdue University for much of his career, retired a number of years ago, took the arguments from God's existence very seriously, but still was unconvinced. And he argued, was a very committed atheist. But in that paper, if you read it, he argues for what he calls friendly atheism, which is this idea that atheists can look at theists and take them seriously and see them as rational persons, even though they think that they're wrong. They've got a mistaken belief. They think that the arguments for theism fail. Well, why? Well, because he thinks atheism is is at least equally rational in light of the kinds of and amounts of evil that exist in our world. But notice here, this isn't arguing that any evil, the kinds and amounts of evil make God's existence certainly make him certainly non-existent, right? For certain, it makes it highly improbable. It's highly unlikely that an all-powerful, all-good God exists in light of the kinds of evil and amounts of evil. So again, here, think of Holocaust or think of children being brutalized. Couldn't God allow us free will but rule out those kinds of evil and the vast amounts of evil that continue to exist? Couldn't he have made a world with a little less evil? Sam Harris, one of our four pictures that we put up the first day of this God question discussion, says the problem of vindicating an omnipotent and omniscient God in the face of evil is an insurmountable problem. Those who claim to have surmounted it by recourses to notions of free will and other incoherencies have merely heaped bad philosophy on bad ethics. All right, there are 2 or 3 lines of response from theists on this evidential problem of evil that was popularized by William Rowe and is really where a lot of the debate is really surrounding today among philosophers of religion. And people like Stephen Wykstra and others have come up with what's called skeptical theism, which in my opinion is not well named because it can be misleading. Really what they're arguing, as we'll see, is that God could have reasons for allowing the kinds and amounts of evil that exist, but human cognitive limitations entail that we're not privy to his reasons, okay? So why does God probably not exist? Well, because of the kinds and amounts of evil. William Rowe gives this example in his paper of this fawn that is struck by a tree, right? The tree has been struck by lightning in a severe storm. The tree falls on this baby deer. The baby deer lies and writhing in pain in the forest for days before it finally dies. William Rowe says, surely there's nothing that would justify God in allowing that sort of evil to happen. What possible good could be coming from that suffering, that animal suffering? What about a child being brutalized? What would justify God in allowing that? There's no good reason. But then you add to that there's no good reason that would morally justify God in allowing the current amount of evil. God could, let's say, reduce evil by a good amount, but there still be some, and that would be a better world on the whole than the one we currently live in. What are some responses? Well, Stephen Wykstra and others in their writing, and you can find this if you go and type in skeptical theism into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you'll find this. Stephen Wykstra has pointed out that Rowe's argument has a hidden premise in it. And once we make that premise explicit, we see that it's a false premise, and therefore the argument fails. That hidden assumption is called a no-seum assumption. That's a fun name for an inference that goes like, well, if I don't see a reason for something, that reason doesn't exist. There isn't one. But that's fallacious, right? Because the fact that I don't see something, it doesn't follow from that it's not there, it doesn't exist, or that there isn't a reason. Let's give a generic example. If I walk into the classroom today and I look around and I say, I don't see a pink elephant circling the projector, the overhead projector. Well, that would be a logically legitimate no-seum inference because elephants are large, we know what pink is, and we can look up at the projector and we can go, yeah, that makes sense. But if I walk in the room and I look around and I say, I don't see any carbon-14 atoms, so there probably aren't any in here. Well, that's a faulty assumption. Why? Well, because with the typical human eye, right, you're not going to see carbon-14 atoms even though they exist. In Weikstra's writings, he considers certain kinds of mosquitoes that are clear and so small that you can't see them with the human eye, but you can see the effects if they bite you. The point here is that our visual equipment needs help to see what is actually there. And so the fact that we don't see what's there with our typical vision or cognitive equipment, it doesn't follow that it's not there. Question, are we likely to see, know, and understand why God allows the kinds and amounts of evil in the world? Do we have the proper cognitive equipment to know God's reasons and to understand them even if we know them, even if he lets us in on them? And Weikstra says, no, we probably don't. Why? Well, because number one, our knowledge of the world's values, what's valuable or good, is incomplete. We might say free will is valuable, virtue is valuable, helping others is valuable, loving others is good. But maybe there are other things we could add to that list of moral good that we have yet to discover. And once we do discover those, we could connect them to maybe what God is preserving, the goods he's trying to promote and preserve by allowing the fawn to suffer in the forest. Number two, maybe it's worse than that. Maybe it's that our perspective on pain and suffering is just limited this side of eternity, right? Given that we're human and we're not divine, we have a limited grasp on reality as well as our pain and suffering. As we often say, hindsight is 20/20. Well, maybe human sight in terms of suffering and pain in general, and even our own pain and suffering, is limited, and it won't be cleared up until maybe when we get to eternity, the other side, let's say, and God lets us in on it. He kind of removes the opaqueness from our cognitive grasp. A third thing that Weikstra says is that our universe is complex, and the complexity means that there are things that we have yet to uncover and discover that could help illuminate this discussion about why God would allow the kinds and amounts of evil. And so what I want to leave you with today is to think about this. This is not necessarily an appeal to mystery, okay? It's not saying that we just can't know. It's a mystery. In some sense, it is saying we don't currently know, but that's like a scientist saying we haven't figured out COVID-19 yet. But we're continuing to look into this with the hopes that we can. Weikstra is saying there are three reasons to think that at present we don't have a satisfying answer, but that doesn't mean we never will. Maybe we have to wait a few years or many years, or maybe we have to wait till God wraps this up and brings us into, let's say, his eternal kingdom. And then he says, well, here's why I allowed the kinds and amounts of evil. So I want you to take a few minutes to think about this. Which argument from evil do you find most compelling, or response to that argument compelling? And where do you stand on this issue? Do you find the responses from theists to be satisfying, or do you have lingering questions and problems that are unanswered? Have a great rest of the day. I'll see you back here next week.